Jamie stood up slowly, using the arm of her chair for support. She was 79 years old, and Michael could see the weight of those years in the way she moved. But her eyes were bright and alert, fixed on the suitcase in his hands. "Mr. Harris?" she said, her voice soft but steady. "Please call me Michael." He walked toward her, feeling the significance of this moment settle over him like a blanket. "And you must be Jamie." She nodded, unable to take her eyes off the suitcase. "Is that it? Is that really it?" "Yes." He set it down on the coffee table between them. "Maybe you should sit down." Jamie lowered herself back into her chair. Michael sat across from her, the suitcase between them like a bridge across decades. Other residents were in the common room playing cards or watching television, but Michael barely noticed them. His whole world had narrowed to this moment, this woman, and the contents of this suitcase. "I don't even know where to start," Jamie said, reaching out to touch the leather. Her fingers trembled. "My mother talked about my father, but she never showed me much. One photograph she kept by her bed. A few stories she'd tell on special occasions, but she never mentioned letters or that she'd kept his uniform. I always thought there just wasn't much to show me." "There's so much," Michael said gently. "Your mother saved everything. Every letter they wrote to each other. Photographs of them together. Your father's uniform from the war. And letters she wrote after he died. Letters she wrote about you." Jamie's hand flew to her mouth. "About me?" Michael nodded. "She wrote to your father after she learned he'd died. She told him about being pregnant, about your birth, about how much she loved you. She was writing to someone who couldn't read the letters, but I think she needed to say the words anyway." Tears were already streaming down Jamie's face. "May I open it?" "Of course. It's yours. It was always meant to be yours." Jamie's hands shook as she reached for the latches. Michael had left them unlocked. She lifted the lid and the hinges creaked with that same sound Michael had heard days ago. The smell of old paper and fabric drifted out. She stared at the contents without touching anything at first, as if she couldn't quite believe they were real. Then carefully she lifted out the first bundle of letters. "These are from my father," Michael said. "To your mother, the ones he sent during the war." Jamie untied the ribbon with fingers that barely cooperated. She pulled out the first letter and began to read. Michael watched her face as she absorbed her father's words for the first time. He saw surprise, then joy, then a deep sadness pass across her features. She read slowly, taking her time with each sentence. When she finished the first letter, she looked up at Michael with tears running down her cheeks. "He had such beautiful handwriting," she said, her voice breaking, "and the way he wrote to her. He loved her so much." "He did," Michael agreed. "Keep reading." "There are dozens of letters." Jamie spent the next hour reading her father's words. She laughed at his jokes, cried at his declarations of love, smiled at his descriptions of the ordinary moments that made up his days. Michael sat quietly, giving her space to meet her father for the first time. "He sounds like he was a wonderful man," Jamie said finally, setting down the stack of letters. "Mom always said he was kind and funny and brave. But reading his actual words, hearing his voice through them, it makes him real in a way he never was before." "Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Michael said. "There's more?" Jamie asked, looking at the suitcase. "Much more. These are your mother's letters to him." Michael handed her the next bundle, the ones she sent while he was overseas. Jamie read these more quickly, clearly recognizing her mother's voice. She smiled at Elizabeth's descriptions of daily life, her complaints about rationing, her dreams for the future. "She was so young," Jamie said. "Only 24 when he died. My whole life I only knew her as my mother, as an older woman. But here she was, just a girl, in love and scared and hopeful." Then Michael handed her the photographs. Jamie gasped when she saw the first one, the picture of her parents together on the porch swing. "I've never seen this," she whispered. "Mom had one photo of him in uniform, very formal. I never knew there were pictures of them together." She looked through each photograph carefully, studying her parents' faces, their smiles, the way they looked at each other. "They were so happy," she said. "You can see it. They really loved each other." "They did," Michael confirmed. He hesitated, then said, "Jamie, there's something else. Letters your mother wrote after your father died. She never mailed them because she'd learned he was gone, but she kept writing to him anyway. And she wrote about you." Jamie looked up, her eyes wide. "She wrote about me?" Michael handed her the sealed letters. "These have been unopened since 1945. I read them because I needed to find you to understand the story. But they're yours now. Your mother's words about your father, about you, about how much she loved you both." Jamie's hands shook so badly that Michael had to help her open the first envelope. She pulled out the letter and began to read her mother's words from November 1945. Learning for the first time about the moment Elizabeth discovered James was dead, Michael watched her face crumple as she read. She pressed the letter to her chest and sobbed, not bothering to hide her tears. A nurse came over, concerned, but Michael gently waved her away. This was grief, yes, but it was also healing. When Jamie composed herself, she continued reading. Michael sat with her through all of it. Through Elizabeth's grief, through the letter announcing Jamie's existence, through the joy of her birth, through the promise made on what would have been her parents' wedding day. "She called me her miracle," Jamie whispered, reading the letter about her birth. "She said I was the best and worst of everything because I was here but Dad wasn't. She loved you so much," Michael said. "You can feel it in every word." Jamie finished all the sealed letters, then sat back in her chair, exhausted but somehow lighter. "I spent my whole life thinking my father never knew about me, that he died without knowing I existed. But Mom told him, didn't she? In these letters, even though he couldn't read them, she told him." "She did," Michael said, "and she kept her promise. She meant to give you all of this. She wrote that she would give you the suitcase when you were old enough to understand. It was just lost by accident, Dorothy told me," Jamie said. "Mom was so upset when she couldn't find it. I helped her look, but we had no idea what was in it. She just said it was old photos and papers. She never told me it was letters from my father. I think maybe she was waiting for the right moment, and then it was gone before she could explain." She looked at the suitcase, at all the treasures spread around them. "This changes everything," she said quietly. "I always knew my parents loved each other. Mom made sure I knew that, but I never really understood the depth of it. The way they wrote to each other, the promises they made, the life they wanted to build together, and I was part of that dream. I wasn't a mistake or a burden. I was wanted. I was loved before I was even born." Michael felt his own throat tighten. "You were very much wanted." Jamie reached back into the suitcase and pulled out the uniform jacket. She held it up, examining it carefully. "This is what he wore," she said in wonder. "This fabric touched his skin. These buttons, he buttoned them every day." She found the pocket and reached inside, pulling out the small photograph of Elizabeth by the river, and he carried Mom's picture with him. He looked at her face when he was scared. "Your mother wrote about that picture," Michael said. "She mentioned the yellow dress the day by the river." Jamie studied the photograph, her mother young and laughing and alive with joy. "I have my mother's eyes," she said. "But I have my father's smile. People used to tell me that, but I never really saw it because I only had that one formal photo. But here in these pictures where he's relaxed and happy, I can see it. I can see myself in him." She looked at Michael with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Why did you do all this? You could have just kept the suitcase or sold it to a collector. These letters and photos, they'd be worth something to the right person. But you spent your time tracking me down, researching my family, finding me. Why?" Michael thought about how to answer. "Because it mattered," he said finally. "Because these aren't just artifacts. They're people's lives, people's hearts. Your mother made a promise to give you this. And even though she died before she could keep that promise, someone needed to keep it for her. I guess I was just the person who ended up with that job." "You're a good man, Michael Harris," Jamie said, wiping her eyes. "I'm just a history teacher who likes old things," Michael said with a small smile. "But maybe this is why. Maybe all those years of collecting vintage items and wondering about their stories was preparing me for this moment. For this story that needed to be finished." Jamie carefully began gathering the letters and photographs. "I have so much to look at, so much to read and reread. My children need to see this. My grandchildren, they need to know where they came from, the love that started it all. Your mother would be happy," Michael said. "She wanted you to know your father, and now you do. Not just as a name or a single photograph, but as a real person who loved and dreamed and fought and died. And who loved my mother completely," Jamie added, "and who would have loved me if he'd gotten the chance." Michael stood up, giving her space with her newfound treasures. "I should let you have time with all of this." Jamie stood too, surprisingly quickly. Before Michael could react, she wrapped her arms around him in a tight hug. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for giving me my father. Thank you for keeping my mother's promise. Thank you for caring enough to find me." Michael hugged her back. This woman he'd just met but who he felt connected to through this strange journey. "You're welcome." It was an honor. As he drove home later, the empty suitcase in his passenger seat feeling lighter than it had in decades, Michael thought about the strange path that had led to this morning. A random trip to a flea market, $20 for an old suitcase, a rusted lock that finally opened, and inside, a love story that had waited 80 years to be completed. He'd given away something valuable, but he'd gained something more. He'd been part of something bigger than himself. He'd helped fulfill a promise made by a mother to her daughter, a promise that transcended death and loss and the simple passage of time. 3 weeks later, Michael received a package in the mail. Inside was a framed photograph, one he recognized immediately. It was the picture of James and Elizabeth on the porch swing, looking at each other with such obvious love. On the back, Jamie had written, "Thank you for bringing my parents home to me. You'll always be part of our story now. With gratitude and love, Jamie." Michael hung the photograph in his classroom above his desk where he could see it every day. His students sometimes asked about it, and he'd tell them it was a reminder that history isn't just dates and battles and presidents. History is people, real people who loved and lost and lived and died. People whose stories matter, even 80 years later. And sometimes, if we're lucky, those stories find their way back to where they belong. Sometimes promises get kept even when it seems impossible. Sometimes an old suitcase from a flea market turns out to hold more than just dusty papers and faded photographs. Sometimes it holds healing. Sometimes it holds closure. Sometimes it holds the answer to questions you've carried your whole life. And sometimes, just sometimes, it holds proof that love is stronger than death, than time, than even an 80-year silence. Because real love, the kind that James and Elizabeth shared, doesn't end when the letters stop coming. It lives on in the children who carry it forward, in the promises that eventually get kept, and in the hearts of strangers who care enough to make sure that love finds its way home. Michael learned something in those weeks after returning the suitcase. He learned that his love of old things, his fascination with the past, wasn't just about nostalgia or curiosity. It was about connection. It was about honoring the people who came before, about recognizing that their lives and loves and losses mattered just as much as ours do today. Every item in a thrift store, every box at an estate sale, every forgotten object gathering dust in an attic has a story. Most of those stories are lost forever. But every once in a while, if you're paying attention, if you care enough to look deeper, you get to be part of bringing one of those stories back to life. And that, Michael realized, was a pretty good reason to keep searching through flea markets on Saturday mornings. Because you never know when you'll find a story that needs telling, a promise that needs keeping, or a love that's waiting to finally come home. Michael couldn't sleep that night. He kept thinking about Jamie somewhere out there, now in her late 70s, never knowing about these letters, never reading her father's words or her mother's promises, never seeing the photographs that proved how much she'd been wanted, how much love had brought her into the world. At 3 a.m, he got up and made coffee. He sat at his kitchen table with his laptop, staring at the suitcase in the dim light of his desk lamp. He'd made a decision. He was going to find Jamie Patterson. He was going to return what her mother had meant for her to have. But where would he even start? He had names and dates from over 80 years ago. He had no idea if Jamie was still alive, if she'd gotten married and changed her name, if she even lived in the same state anymore. The whole thing seemed impossible. Michael took a sip of coffee and opened his laptop. When you're a history teacher, you learn to be a detective of the past. You learn to trace threads through time, to find connections between then and now. If he could teach his students to research World War II battles and presidential elections, surely he could find one person. He started with what he knew for certain. James Patterson had died in France in July 1945. Michael went to a military database and searched for casualties from that time period. It took him 20 minutes, but he found it. James Robert Patterson, Private First Class, died July 28, 1945, in combat operations near Strasbourg, age 24. Posthumously awarded the Bronze Star for valor. Michael stared at the screen. There he was. Not just a name in a letter, but a real record, a real person who'd lived and died. The database gave him more information. James had been from Millbrook, a small town about 40 miles from where Michael lived. His parents were listed as Robert and Ann Patterson. That was something. That was a place to start. Next, Michael searched for Elizabeth Morrison. He found her in old census records. Born 1921 in Millbrook. Parents were Richard and Helen Morrison. She'd worked at a textile factory during the war, just like she'd mentioned in her letters. But after 1946, the trail went cold. Elizabeth seemed to disappear from records in Millbrook. Maybe she'd moved away. Maybe she'd wanted to escape the gossip, to start fresh somewhere new with her baby. Michael sat back and rubbed his eyes. This was harder than he'd thought. He tried a different approach. He searched for birth records from April 1946 in the county where Millbrook was located. He had to go through pages of scanned documents, old handwritten forms that had been digitized but not indexed. His eyes ached from staring at the screen, and then he found it. Jamie Elizabeth Patterson, born April 15, 1946, mother listed as Elizabeth Morrison, father listed as James Patterson, deceased. Michael felt a rush of triumph. She was real. Jamie was real, and now he had proof. He searched for Jamie Patterson next, but it was a common enough name that he got hundreds of results. He needed more information. He needed to narrow it down. Michael thought about what he knew. Elizabeth had kept the suitcase, intending to give it to Jamie someday. So what had happened? Why had the suitcase ended up in an estate sale, separated from the family? He searched for Elizabeth Morrison again, this time adding death records. It took a while, but eventually he found it. Elizabeth Morrison Patterson died March 2019, age 97, in Millbrook. She'd gone back. After all those years, she'd returned to the town where she'd fallen in love, where she'd lost James, where she'd raised their daughter alone. And she'd lived a long life. That gave Michael some comfort, at least. The obituary was brief but helpful. It mentioned she was preceded in death by her parents and by James Patterson, her wartime sweetheart. She was survived by her daughter, Jamie Patterson Williams, and 2 grandchildren. Williams. Jamie had gotten married. That's why he couldn't find her under Patterson alone. Michael searched for Jamie Patterson Williams. This time, the results were more manageable. He found a woman who would be about the right age, living in a town called Riverside, about 60 miles away. But how could he be sure it was her? He didn't want to contact the wrong person with this story. He looked at the obituary again. It mentioned that Elizabeth had been a long-time member of the Millbrook Historical Society and had volunteered at the local library for 30 years. Michael had an idea. At 9 in the morning, as soon as they opened, he called the Millbrook Public Library. An elderly woman answered, her voice cheerful and warm. "Hi," Michael said, suddenly nervous. "I know this is a strange question, but I'm trying to find information about someone who used to volunteer there." "Elizabeth Morrison Patterson?" "Oh, Beth," the woman said immediately. Yes, I knew her well. "I'm Dorothy. I've been working here for 40 years. Beth and I shelved books together every Tuesday for decades. Such a lovely woman. We all miss her terribly." Michael's heart raced. This was exactly what he needed. "Dorothy, I found something that belonged to her, and I'd like to return it to her family. Do you happen to know how I could contact her daughter?" There was a pause. "May I ask what you found?" Michael chose his words carefully. "A suitcase with some old letters and photographs. Personal items from the 1940s. I think they were very important to her." Dorothy gasped softly. "The suitcase." "Oh my goodness." "Beth talked about that suitcase." "She did?" "Years ago, maybe 10 years back, she came in very upset. She'd been moving into a smaller apartment, downsizing, you know, and some things had gotten confused in the move. She'd been looking everywhere for an old suitcase. She described it just like you said. Letters and photographs from the war. She was heartbroken that it was missing." Michael felt his throat tighten. So Elizabeth had lost it accidentally, not on purpose. She'd spent her last years looking for it. "She searched for months," Dorothy continued. "We all helped her look. We thought maybe it had been donated by mistake or left behind at her old place. But we never found it. She always said it was meant for her daughter, that it had Jamie's father's letters in it. Beth wanted Jamie to have it before she passed away, but it just disappeared." "I have it," Michael said quietly. "I bought it at a flea market. I'm guessing whoever cleaned out her first apartment sold it without realizing what it was." "Oh, Beth would be so relieved," Dorothy said, her voice thick with emotion. She talked about it right up until the end. It weighed on her heart. "Can you help me find Jamie?" Dorothy hesitated. I shouldn't give out personal information. But this is different, isn't it? This is something Beth wanted her to have. Tell you what, let me call Jamie myself and explain the situation. If she wants to meet you, I'll put you in touch. Does that work? That would be perfect, Michael said. He gave Dorothy his phone number and email address, then spent the rest of the day unable to focus on anything. He graded papers without really reading them. He tried to watch TV but couldn't follow the plot. He just kept thinking about Jamie, about whether she'd want to meet him, about whether this would mean as much to her as he hoped it would. His phone rang at 6 that evening. Unknown number. Hello? Is this Michael Harris? A woman's voice, older, cautious. Yes, this is Michael. This is Jamie Williams. Dorothy from the library called me. She said you found my mother's suitcase. Michael's hands were shaking. Yes, I did. I found it at a flea market a few days ago. I had no idea what was inside until I opened it. There was a long silence. Then Dorothy said there are letters. From my father? Yes, and photographs. And his uniform. Your mother kept everything. He heard her breath catch. I never knew any of this existed. Mom told me about my father, of course. She showed me one picture she kept in her bedroom. She told me he died in the war before I was born. But I didn't know there were letters. I didn't know she'd saved all of this. She meant for you to have it, Michael said. She wrote that in one of her last letters to your father. She promised to give you the suitcase when you were old enough, but I guess it got lost in her move. The move to the assisted living place, Jamie said, understanding in her voice. Things were chaotic. Some of her belongings got mixed up, sent to different places. We tried to track everything down, but some items just vanished. I never imagined this was one of them. Would you like to have it? Michael asked. I'd be honored to return it to you. Another long silence, then very quietly. Yes, please. I'd like that very much. They arranged to meet the following Saturday. Jamie lived at a place called Sunset Grove, a nursing home in Riverside where she'd moved after a fall last year. She gave him the address and told him visiting hours started at 10 in the morning. After they hung up, Michael sat holding his phone, feeling like he'd just completed the most important task of his life. He looked at the suitcase, at the letters and photographs spread across his table. In a few days, they'd be back where they belonged. Elizabeth's promise would finally be kept, even if it was decades late. That week crawled by. Michael found himself rereading the letters, memorizing the photographs. He carefully packed everything back into the suitcase, arranging it the way he'd found it. He bought a nice box to protect the suitcase during transport. On Friday night, he barely slept. He kept imagining how Jamie would react. Would she cry? Would she be overwhelmed? Would it be too much, learning all of this at once about her parents? Saturday morning, Michael dressed carefully. This felt like an important occasion, like something that deserved respect. He put the suitcase in his car and drove to Riverside. Sunset Grove was a nice facility, clean and bright with gardens around the building. Michael checked in at the front desk and a nurse directed him to the common room. Jamie's expecting you, the nurse said with a kind smile. She's been excited all week. She barely slept last night. Michael walked down the hall carrying the suitcase, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He turned into the common room and stopped. A woman sat by the window. She had white hair and wore a cardigan despite the warm day. She was staring out at the garden, her hands folded in her lap. And when she turned at the sound of his footsteps, Michael saw it immediately. She had her father's eyes. Those dark blue eyes from the photographs, the ones Elizabeth had written about. They were looking at him now across 80 years, waiting to finally meet the father she'd never known. Michael's hands trembled as he unfolded the first sealed letter. The paper crinkled softly, breaking a silence that had lasted 80 years. He took a deep breath and began to read. My dearest James, Elizabeth had written. It's been 2 months since the war ended and I haven't heard from you. I keep telling myself there's a good reason. Maybe you're on a ship coming home and can't send mail. Maybe your letters got lost somewhere. Maybe you're in a hospital recovering from an injury you didn't want me to worry about. Michael's chest tightened. He could feel Elizabeth's desperation in every word. I go to the train station every Tuesday and Friday when the soldiers come home, she continued. I watch every face looking for yours. The other girls have gotten their men back. Helen's fiancé came home 3 weeks ago. They're getting married next month. She asked me to be in the wedding and I said yes, but James, I don't know if I can stand there watching her marry her soldier. when I don't know where mine is." The letter went on for 3 pages. Elizabeth described going to James's parents' house, how his mother would just shake her head and say they hadn't heard anything either. She talked about writing to the War Department, sending letters that went unanswered. She mentioned the nightmares she'd started having, waking up in the middle of the night convinced something terrible had happened. "I still wear your ring on the chain," she wrote at the end. "I won't take it off until you come home and put it on my finger properly. I'm waiting for you, James. I'll wait as long as it takes. Forever yours, Elizabeth." Michael set the letter down and pressed his palms against his eyes. He knew what was coming, but that didn't make it easier. He opened the second sealed letter. This one was dated a month later, November 1945. "My dearest James," it began, and Michael could already hear the change in her tone. "I went to your parents' house today. Your mother answered the door, and I knew right away something had changed. She'd been crying. Your father was sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands." Michael had to pause. He could picture it so clearly, that terrible moment when everything changed. "They got a letter from the army, James. You're gone. You died in France in July, just 2 weeks before the war ended. 2 weeks. If the war had ended 2 weeks earlier, you'd be home. We'd be planning our wedding right now instead of me sitting here trying to figure out how to breathe without you." The handwriting got messier here, like Elizabeth's hand had been shaking as she wrote. "They said you died a hero. You saved 3 men in your unit when your position was attacked. They're going to give you medals. Your mother showed me the letter, and all I could think was that I don't want medals. I want you. I want you making terrible jokes and leaving your tools everywhere and arguing with me about whether to get a dog or a cat first. I want our ordinary life, James. I want every boring, beautiful day we were supposed to have together." Michael had to stop reading. Tears were streaming down his face, and he didn't try to wipe them away. He just sat there, holding a letter from a woman he'd never met, feeling her grief as fresh as the day she'd written it. After a few minutes, he continued reading. Elizabeth wrote about the funeral, how they'd had a ceremony at the church even though there was no body to bury. She described how empty the hardware store felt without James there. She mentioned seeing his uniform hanging in his parents' house and having to leave because she couldn't breathe. "I don't know how to do this," she wrote. "Everyone keeps saying it will get easier. That time heals all wounds, but James, I don't want it to get easier. I don't want to forget what it feels like to love you. If the pain goes away, does that mean the love goes away too? I can't bear that thought." The letter ended differently than the others. "No, forever yours." Just her name, Elizabeth, written small and alone at the bottom of the page. Michael picked up the third sealed letter with shaking hands. This one was dated December 1945, 3 months after Elizabeth learned James had died. "My dearest James," she began, and Michael was struck by how she still wrote to him, still called him her dearest, even though she knew he'd never read these words. "I have something to tell you, and I don't know how to say it except straight out. I'm pregnant. We're going to have a baby." Michael sat up straighter. He hadn't expected this. "Remember that last weekend before you shipped out?" Elizabeth wrote, "when we borrowed your uncle's cabin by the lake? Your parents thought I was staying with Helen, and my parents thought I was at your parents' house. We had 2 days together, just us, pretending the war wasn't happening and you weren't leaving. I know we weren't married yet, and I know people would judge us if they knew, but James, I can't regret it. Those 2 days were perfect. They were ours. Michael could imagine it. 2 young people in love, stealing a few precious days before war tore them apart, not knowing those days would be their last together. I'm 4 months along now," Elizabeth continued. "I haven't told anyone yet. I've been wearing loose dresses and making excuses about why I'm sick in the mornings. But I can't hide it much longer. People are going to talk, James. They're going to say terrible things about me, about our baby. Part of me doesn't care what they think. But another part of me is terrified." She went on to describe her fears. How would she support a child alone? What would she tell the baby about its father? How would she explain that she and James never got to marry? That their baby was conceived in love but would be born into a world that called her shameful names? "Your mother doesn't know yet," Elizabeth wrote. "I'm going to tell her soon. I hope she doesn't hate me. I hope she'll want to know her grandchild. Because, James, this baby is all I have left of you. This baby is the future we dreamed about, just in a different form than we planned." Michael noticed his hands were gripping the letter so tightly they'd gone white. He loosened his hold, afraid he'd tear the fragile paper. I've been thinking about names, Elizabeth wrote, her tone brightening just slightly. If it's a boy, I want to name him after you. James Parker Morrison, after both you and my father. But if it's a girl, I was thinking Jamie. It's close enough to your name that she'll carry a part of you, but her own person too. What do you think? I wish I could hear what you'd say. I wish I could see your face when I tell you you're going to be a father. The letter continued for several more pages. Elizabeth talked about feeling the baby move for the first time. She described setting up a nursery in her small room at her parents' house, how she was saving every penny from her factory job to buy baby clothes and supplies. She mentioned reading parenting books from the library, trying to learn how to do this alone. I'm scared, James, she admitted near the end. I'm so scared, but I'm also grateful. Grateful that I have this piece of you growing inside me. Grateful that you'll live on through our child. Grateful for those 2 days at the cabin, even though they led to this complicated situation. At least I got to love you completely. At least we had that. The letter ended with a promise. I'll tell our baby about you every day. About how brave you were, how kind, how you made me laugh even when times were hard. I'll make sure they know their father was a hero, not just to his country, but to me. I'll make sure they know how much you love them, even though you never got to meet them. And I'll keep all these letters, all these photographs, everything we had together. Someday, when they're old enough, I'll give them this suitcase and let them know you themselves. Michael set the letter down and looked at the suitcase. So that was the plan. Elizabeth had intended to give all of this to her daughter, to let Jamie know the father she'd never met. But somehow it had gotten lost, separated from Elizabeth, sold at an estate sale, and ended up under a table at a flea market. There were 2 more sealed letters. Michael opened the next one, dated April 1946. My dearest James, Elizabeth wrote. She's here. Our daughter was born 3 days ago on April 15th. I named her Jamie Elizabeth Patterson. She has your eyes, James, I swear she does. They're the same dark blue yours were. The nurses say all babies have blue eyes and they might change, but I know better. These are your eyes looking up at me. Michael smiled through his tears. Elizabeth's joy radiated through her words, cutting through the grief that had filled her previous letters. She's perfect, Elizabeth continued. 7 pounds, 2 ounces. A good amount of dark hair that sticks up in every direction. Long fingers like yours, like she's already reaching for something. When I hold her, James, it's like holding both the best and worst of everything. The best, because she's beautiful and healthy and here. The worst, because you're not here to see her. You should be here. You should be pacing in the waiting room like the other fathers, smoking cigarettes and wearing out the floor. You should be holding her, counting her tiny fingers, making plans for teaching her how to ride a bike and fish and all the things you wanted to do. She described the first few days of Jamie's life, the exhaustion of new motherhood, the wonder of watching this tiny person sleep and eat and exist, the loneliness of doing it without James beside her. Your mother came to meet her, Elizabeth wrote. She held Jamie and cried. Then she told me that I'd always be family, that her grandchild would never want for anything if she could help it. She's been wonderful, James. Both your parents have. They don't judge me or ask questions about what people think. They just love Jamie because she's part of you. Michael felt relief wash through him. At least Elizabeth hadn't been completely alone. I'm going to keep writing to you, Elizabeth promised at the end of the letter. I know you're gone. I know these letters will never be read, but it helps somehow putting these words on paper. It feels like I'm still talking to you, still sharing my life with you even though you're not here. Is that foolish? Maybe, but I don't care. Forever yours, Elizabeth. There was one more sealed letter. This one was dated August 1946, over a year after James's death. My dearest James, Elizabeth began. Today is what would have been our wedding day. We picked August 10th, remember? You said August because it would be warm enough for an outdoor reception, but not so hot that everyone would be miserable in suits and nice dresses. I said the 10th because that's the day we first kissed, behind the school gymnasium after the homecoming game. You were so nervous you almost missed my mouth. Michael could hear her trying to keep her tone light, but the sadness underneath was impossible to miss. I thought today would destroy me, she admitted. I thought I'd spend the whole day in bed crying and wondering what might have been. But you know what happened? Jamie laughed for the first time. An actual real laugh, not just a gas bubble or a reflex. She was lying on her blanket looking up at the ceiling fan and she just burst out laughing. James, it was the most beautiful sound I've ever heard. She described how that laugh had felt like a sign, like James sending her a message that life goes on, that there's still joy to be found even in the middle of grief. "I'm going to be okay," Elizabeth wrote, and Michael could feel the determination in her words. "We're going to be okay, me and Jamie. I'll never stop loving you. I'll never stop missing you. But I'm going to live, James. I'm going to raise our daughter, and I'm going to make sure she has a good life. I'm going to be both mother and father to her. I'm going to love her enough for both of us." The final paragraph made Michael's tears fall fresh. "I'm putting all these letters in your suitcase, the one you took to training camp. I'm adding the letters you sent me, the photographs we took, your uniform, everything I have of our time together. Someday, when Jamie is old enough to understand, I'll give this to her. She'll read your words in mine. She'll see the love we had. She'll know that she came from something beautiful, even if it was brief. She'll know her father not just as a name on a grave marker, but as a real person who loved and laughed and dreamed. That's my promise to you. Forever yours, Elizabeth." Michael sat in the growing darkness of his apartment, surrounded by the pieces of this story. Elizabeth and James separated by war, a baby born after her father's death, a mother promising to keep his memory alive, and somehow that promise had gotten broken. The suitcase had been lost, sold, forgotten. Jamie had grown up without reading these letters, without knowing the full story of her parents' love. But maybe it wasn't too late. Michael looked at the letters, the photographs, the uniform. Maybe this story didn't have to end with loss and separation. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to fulfill Elizabeth's promise after all these years. The first letter Michael pulled from the bundle was written on paper so thin he was afraid it might tear in his hands. He held it up to the light and could see the shadow of the words written on the back bleeding through. The handwriting was beautiful, each letter formed with care and precision. "My dearest James," it began, "I hope this letter finds you safe and well. It's been 3 weeks since you left, and already it feels like 3 years. Michael felt like he was intruding on something private, reading words meant for someone else's eyes. But the writer and the intended reader were both long gone now. These words had been waiting in darkness for decades, and maybe they needed to be read again. Maybe that's why the suitcase had found him. He continued reading. The letter was from someone named Elizabeth, writing to a soldier named James during World War II. She talked about her job at a factory, making parachutes for the military. She described her roommate Helen, who snored and took forever in the bathroom. She mentioned the victory garden they'd planted in the backyard, how the tomatoes were finally coming in. But mostly she wrote about missing him, about how she'd see a man in uniform from behind and her heart would jump, thinking it was James coming home early. About how she slept in his old sweater because it still smelled like him. About counting down the days until he'd be back. The letter ended with "Forever yours, Elizabeth," and a lipstick kiss pressed onto the paper. Michael could still see the faint red mark, faded now, but still there after all these years. He carefully set the first letter aside and reached for the next one. Then the next. Letter after letter he read through Elizabeth's words. They were dated weeks apart, sometimes months. James must have kept every single one she sent him. As Michael read, he started to piece together their story. Elizabeth and James had grown up in the same small town. They'd known each other since grade school, but didn't start courting until they were both 19. James worked at his father's hardware store. Elizabeth had dreams of becoming a teacher. Then the war came. James enlisted in 1942, right after Pearl Harbor. He and Elizabeth got engaged before he left for basic training. She wore his ring on a chain around her neck because her fingers were too small for it. They planned to marry as soon as he came home. Through her letters, Michael watched Elizabeth's life unfold. She wrote about bond drives and rationing, about learning to live without sugar and coffee. She told James about letters from other boys in town who'd gone to war, and the growing list of those who wouldn't be coming back. She tried to stay cheerful in her writing, but sometimes the fear crept through. What if he didn't come home? What if she never saw him again? Michael opened the next bundle of letters. These were different. They were James's letters to Elizabeth, the ones he'd sent from training camp, then from England, then from France after D-Day. His handwriting was messier than hers, more rushed, like he was trying to fit as many words as possible onto each page before the mail went out. James wrote about his buddies in his unit, guys with names like Benny and Red and Dutch. He wrote about terrible food and uncomfortable bunks and marches that went on for miles. But he also wrote about hope, about the life they'd build together when he got back. The house they'd buy, the kids they'd have, the ordinary, beautiful life that waited on the other side of all this darkness. "I think about you every night," James wrote in a letter from October 1944. "When things get scary, I close my eyes and picture your face. I remember that afternoon by the river, before I left. Do you remember? You wore that yellow dress and the sun was in your hair, and I thought I'd never seen anything so beautiful. I keep that memory like a photograph in my mind. It reminds me what I'm fighting for. It reminds me to stay alive." Michael had to stop reading for a moment. His eyes were burning and he realized he was holding his breath. These weren't just old letters. They were pieces of two people's hearts preserved in ink and paper. He got up and poured himself a glass of water, then returned to the suitcase. Underneath the letters were photographs, black and white images, some crisp and clear, others faded and slightly blurred. He spread them out on the table. There was James in his uniform, standing at attention, trying to look serious but with a hint of a smile breaking through. He was young, maybe 22 or 23, with dark hair and kind eyes. In another photo, he was with his unit, all of them muddy and exhausted but with their arms around each other's shoulders. Then there was Elizabeth. Michael caught his breath when he saw her. She was beautiful, with wavy hair pinned back from her face and a smile that seemed to light up the photograph. In one picture, she was standing in front of a brick building in a floral dress, holding a person looking at the camera with such joy that it made Michael's chest ache. There was a photo of them together, taken before James left. They were sitting on a porch swing, Elizabeth tucked under James's arm, both of them looking at each other instead of at the camera. You could see the love in that single frozen moment. It was so clear, so pure that it transcended the decades between then and now. Michael found more photos. Elizabeth with her parents, James with his family in front of the hardware store, pictures of a town that probably didn't look the same anymore, of people who were all gone now, of a world that had been transformed by the war they were living through. At the bottom of the suitcase was a piece of clothing. Michael lifted it carefully. It was a military uniform jacket, olive drab with patches sewn on the shoulders. James's uniform. Elizabeth had kept it all these years. Michael examined it closely. There were moth holes in the wool, but otherwise it was in decent shape. The buttons were still attached. Inside the breast pocket, he found something that made his throat tight. A photograph, smaller than the others, bent and worn at the edges from being carried. It was Elizabeth in that yellow dress James had written about, standing by a river laughing at something off camera. This was the photograph James had carried with him through the war. The one he'd looked at when things got scary. The one that reminded him to stay alive. Michael sat back in his chair, surrounded by these pieces of the past. He looked at the letters, the photographs, the uniform. He thought about Elizabeth working at the factory and writing letters and waiting. He thought about James, carrying her picture into battle and dreaming of the life they'd build. But there was something else in the suitcase. More letters, these still bundled separately. Their ribbons were different, darker, and when Michael picked them up, he noticed something that sent a chill through him. These letters were still sealed. The envelopes had never been opened. He looked at the dates. They were from late 1945 and early 1946, after the war in Europe had ended. They were all addressed to James, all from Elizabeth, and none of them had ever been read. Michael's hands were shaking now. He understood what this meant. If James had never read these letters, it was because he'd never received them. And if he'd never received them, it meant he hadn't come home. The suitcase suddenly felt different. This wasn't just a collection of memories. It was a tragedy, preserved and hidden away because it was too painful to look at. Michael carefully set down the sealed letters. He wasn't sure if he should open them. They'd been sealed for 80 years, carrying words that James had never heard, messages that had gone undelivered. But he also knew that if he didn't open them, no one ever would. Whatever Elizabeth had written in those final letters, whatever she'd needed to say, it deserved to be heard by someone, even if it couldn't be James. The sun was starting to set outside his window. Michael had been reading for hours, lost in 1943 and 1944 and 1945. His coffee had gone cold. His phone had buzzed with messages he'd ignored. He picked up the first sealed envelope. His heart was pounding. He slid his finger under the flap, trying to be gentle, trying to preserve it even as he broke a seal that had held for 8 decades. The envelope opened, and Michael pulled out the letter inside. Elizabeth's familiar handwriting filled the page, but this time the words were different, heavier, written in grief instead of hope. Michael began to read, and he understood that he was about to learn the rest of the story, the part that had been too painful to share, the part that had been locked away in a suitcase and hidden from the world, the part where love met loss, and somehow had to find a way to survive anyway. Michael Harris woke up that Saturday morning with no particular plans. He was a high school history teacher, 42 years old, and lately he'd been feeling like life had become a little too predictable. Same routine every day, same lessons every year, same quiet apartment waiting for him every evening. His ex-wife used to joke that he lived more in the past than the present, always collecting old books and vintage photographs from thrift stores. Maybe she was right. He poured himself a cup of coffee and looked out the window. It was one of those humid June mornings where the air felt thick even at 8 in the morning, the kind of day where you know it's going to be hot by noon. He thought about staying home, maybe grading some papers or watching a documentary. But something made him grab his keys and head out the door. Henderson's flea market was about 20 minutes from his place. He'd been going there for years, ever since he first moved to town. It wasn't fancy, just rows of tables set up in an old parking lot with vendors selling everything from used tools to handmade jewelry. Most people were there looking for deals on furniture or clothes. Michael went for the stories. Every old item had a history, he believed. A chipped teacup might have been someone's favorite for morning tea. A scratched record could have been playing during someone's first dance. He liked imagining the lives these objects had touched before ending up on a folding table for $5. The market was already crowded when he arrived. Families walked together, couples hunted for bargains, and serious collectors moved quickly from table to table. Michael took his time, wandering slowly through the aisles. He picked up a few old postcards from the 1950s, flipped through some vinyl records, and examined a brass compass that didn't work anymore. He was about to leave when he noticed a table he'd almost walked past. It was run by an elderly woman he'd seen before but never really talked to. Her name tag said Mrs. Chen. She was arranging some books when Michael spotted something underneath her table. It was a suitcase. Not a modern one with wheels and bright colors, but an old leather suitcase. The kind people used to carry on trains decades ago. It was scuffed and worn, with a leather handle that looked like it had been gripped by countless hands. The corners were reinforced with metal that had dulled with age. Michael knelt down to get a better look. There was something about it that caught his attention. He couldn't quite explain it. Maybe it was the craftsmanship, the way it had been made to last. Or maybe it was just that feeling he sometimes got around old things, like they were waiting to tell their story. "How much for the suitcase?" he asked Mrs. Chen.